The town was little more than a scratch in the dust, stitched together by crooked porches and one road that led nowhere worth naming. It had no real name itself, only whispers passed between cattlemen and saloon girls. Ghostlight Hollow, maybe, or Drabone Crossing. To her, it was just another place to disappear. She came walking at dawn, barefoot, dress hem ragged from brambles and creek beds. Her hair hung in matted ropes down her back, sunburn peeling off her shoulders like old paper. She moved like a creature half forgotten by the world, each step hesitant, as if the ground might reject her for having the audacity to still be alive. She couldn't have been more than 17, though hardship had drawn lines under her eyes and starved the softness from her cheeks. She didn't walk like a girl raised with laughter, she walked like someone used to running. A runaway, sure as blood follows the knife. Nobody asked where from. Nobody cared to. The butcher's wife watched her pass and clucked her tongue. A gambler leaning against the saloon post spat and said, "Another stray." That time of year. But no one stopped her. They never did. That was the thing about the West. It was too big to notice the small lost things. She found a place to curl up behind the smith's forge, out of the wind. When the heat of morning came, she stole water from a trough and a piece of bread left for the ravens. Her hunger didn't complain anymore, it had become part of her, like the scar behind her ear or the calluses on her soles. There was no plan in her, only movement. She had once believed in plans, had made one to escape the place with the leather straps and the silent meals and the man who called her girl like it meant something cruel. But escape wasn't a destination. It was just falling, slow and endless. 3 days she drifted on the edge of town, invisible. On the 4th, the wrong eyes found her. He was clean-shaven, his boots polished, a man who smiled with teeth too perfect for cattle dust. Called himself Mr. Harlan. He offered her an orange, an actual orange, and a place to sleep for the night. She didn't want to go. But hunger is a voice louder than fear. She woke in a locked room. No windows. One door. A cot and a bucket. The air smelled of rust and lies. Mr. Harlan didn't come back that night, but the next morning, a man with a ledger did. She was catalogued. Measured. Not spoken to, only spoken over. They tied her hands with coarse rope, soft enough not to bruise but tight enough she couldn't forget it. They didn't use her name, didn't ask for it. She hadn't used it herself in so long it barely stirred in her chest. On the 7th day they led her to the auction barn. It was nothing more than an old feed shed behind the saloon, but men gathered like buzzards all the same. A dusty room thick with the stink of sweat and cigar smoke. They lined the girls up, 5 of them. Older than her, some younger. None looked up. She did. She scanned the crowd, not for salvation, but for measure. If there was a door, a crack, a kindness. There wasn't. The auctioneer was thin and reedy, like a fence post with a voice. He rattled off numbers like it was livestock, and maybe it was, to them. The girl before her fetched $30. Another, 15. Then they pushed her forward. Here now, she's a wild one. Untouched, I reckon, but don't count on spirit. Might be dumb as dirt. A ripple of laughter. Start at 5. Silence. No bids. Come on, boys, she's not diseased. $5. Still silence. One man chuckled. Not worth the rope. She stared ahead. Not at the faces, but beyond them, at a crack of daylight spilling through the barn door like a promise no one meant to keep. She didn't tremble. Didn't flinch. Then, from the back of the room, a hand rose. 2 fingers. No voice. Just a gesture. The room shifted. Well now, said the auctioneer, lips twitching. The mute one bids. $5. Sold. The girl turned her head. He stood in the shadow near the door, tall and lean in a coat sun-bleached to the color of old bone. His face was mostly hidden by the brim of his hat, but she saw the edge of his jaw, unshaven. Dust covered his boot. He looked like he belonged to the land itself, silent, still, and rough-hewn. No one cheered. No one cared. But when he walked forward, it wasn't with the pride of ownership. It was with something else. Something quieter. He took the rope from the man holding her, coiled it neatly in his hand, then let it drop. Her wrists were still bound, but he didn't pull. Didn't lead. He just turned and walked. She followed. Not because she trusted him. She didn't trust anything that moved. But he hadn't looked at her the way the others did. Hadn't smiled. Hadn't weighed her. They walked through town in silence. No one stopped them. The sheriff tipped his hat but said nothing. The sky overhead stretched wide and empty. Outside the town, by a willow tree, he stopped. He pulled a small knife from his belt and cut her rope. She held her wrists out like she expected him to change his mind. He didn't. He stepped back, then reached into his saddlebag and handed her a canteen and a hunk of dried meat. Still silent. Still not meeting her eyes. She took it. Sat cross-legged on the grass. He built a fire but didn't speak. Night fell like a hush. She watched him as he fed the flames, his hands moving with the ease of a man who lived more in silence than in speech. He didn't ask her name. Didn't offer his. But as she drifted to sleep beside the fire, full for the first time in weeks, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of her running. Maybe it was the start of being seen. Morning came soft and unsure, like a child asking permission to be heard. The light touched the tips of the prairie grass first, then the man's boots, then her closed eyelids. She opened her eyes to stillness. No shouting, no clanging pans, no doors slamming. Just a crackling fire, the chirp of unseen birds, and the silent figure across from her, sipping coffee from a blackened tin cup as if the world had never known noise. She didn't speak right away. It had been too long since she'd woken without fear nipping at her throat. Her body still braced for pain, even in peace. She shifted on the blanket he'd laid out for her and watched him. He didn't glance her way. Not to check if she'd run. Not to see if she still breathed. There was no doubt in him. He just handed her a cup, filled with lukewarm coffee, and resumed watching the horizon as if it had promised to reveal something. The quiet unnerved her more than cruelty ever had. Men always wanted something. They talked when they wanted it quicker. But this one, he said nothing. He looked like he'd buried entire stories in that silence, none of which he was willing to share, not even for warmth. She drank. The bitterness clung to her tongue. Her voice, dry from days without true speech, cracked like a frost-thinned branch. "Why'd you buy me?" His gaze didn't move. Only his voice came, low and flat. "Didn't." She blinked. "You raised your hand." "Didn't buy you," he said again, slower now. "Freed you." She looked down at her own hands, still lined with rope marks. She hadn't thought of freedom like this, unceremonious and awkward, sitting in dirt with a man who smelled like sweat and cedarwood. But she couldn't deny the truth. The ropes were gone. She wasn't in a cage. And no one had tried to touch her. He stood, poured the dregs of his coffee into the ground, then turned toward the saddle. A horse stood tethered nearby, a paint mare with uneven eyes. He packed without words, his hands sure and practiced. She didn't move. "You leavin'?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. He looked at her finally. Eyes the color of storm-washed earth. "Heading west." "What happens to me?" "That's yours to decide." She wanted to scoff, laugh maybe. Since when did girls like her get to decide anything? But he meant it. She could feel it in his stillness. He'd given her the road and refused to point a direction. That was its own kind of mercy. She stood, unsteady at first. "I got nowhere to go." He nodded, as if that was neither a burden nor a surprise. "Then ride." She squinted. "You got 2 horses?" He didn't answer. Just tossed her the reins of the pack mule she hadn't noticed before, short-legged, sour-faced, but strong. She caught them with fingers still unsure of kindness. Then he mounted without waiting and began to ride. Not fast. Just steady. She followed. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. The land unfolded around them, wide and golden, dotted with sagebrush and old cottonwoods. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. She watched it spiral and wondered what it felt like to rise so high above the noise. By sundown, they reached a dry creek. He dismounted and started gathering brush. She didn't wait to be told. She helped. Without thinking. Without asking. Later, as the fire burned low, she leaned back against a stump and let herself look at him. Really look. He wasn't old, mid-30s, maybe, but there was wear on him that no number could explain. Sun-creased skin. Knuckles like broken stones. A scar across his jaw that looked like a blade had kissed him once and left a memory. "Do you talk to anybody?" she asked. He shrugged. "Talkin's easy. Listening's rarer." That stayed with her. She repeated it silently, tasting its weight. No one had ever said it before, but it felt true. People spoke at her, not to her. Yelled commands, barked questions. He was different. He left room for answers before asking. As days passed, their travel grew into rhythm. She never asked where they were going, and he never offered. The mule grew fond of her. The mare only tolerated her. But he was steady. Not kind, exactly, not warm. Just present. And that, she realized, was a kind of kindness she hadn't known existed. He showed her how to spot snake holes, how to find the shadow of water under cracked soil. One night, he handed her his knife and showed her how to clean a rabbit. He didn't flinch when she gagged. Didn't laugh. Just showed her again. Trust began not with grand gestures, but with small acts. A shared apple. A blanket given without question. A moment where he stepped in front of her when coyotes crept too close. She didn't need saving, but she noticed. He didn't treat her like glass, nor like property. He treated her like someone who mattered, even when she said nothing at all. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks, they reached a half-forgotten outpost where a woman sold honey and stitched shirt. He bought new boot. She lingered by the shelves. The woman, kind-eyed and gray-haired, asked if she was his wife. She froze. Before she could stammer a lie, the cowboy said, "She's traveling." Nothing more. The woman nodded and handed her a ribbon, no charge. "For the hair," she said. The girl didn't cry, but it felt like something in her ribs cracked open. No one had given her anything gentle in so long, she'd forgotten how to hold it. That night, she tied the ribbon into her braid. When he looked at her by firelight, his eyes softened, not with want, not with pity. Just understanding. She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. She didn't know his name yet. He hadn't offered. And she still hadn't said hers out loud. Names felt too big, too permanent. But she thought about it. Thought maybe soon, she'd tell him. Just to see how it sounded again. Their silence became a language of its own. When the wind changed, they knew it meant rain. When he tilted his head, it meant pause. When she looked back before mounting up, he knew she needed time. They came across a family stuck in the mud, wagon axle broken. The cowboy helped without a word. The girl stayed back, unsure. But the smallest child offered her a tin cup of water. She took it, hands trembling. No one asked who she was. No one stared. After, as they rode away, she whispered, "Why help them?" He said, "Because we can." Not because it was owed. Not because they were good. Just because it mattered. That night, as the stars blinked awake above them, she spoke into the quiet. "I think I had a brother once." He didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. She continued. "We used to chase frogs in a pond. I don't remember his face. Just his laugh." Still silence. But it wasn't empty. It held space for her to remember. Then, after a long while, he said, "I had a sister. Died young. That was all. But it made her feel less alone. Like maybe they both carried ghosts in their saddlebag." She fell asleep closer to the fire that night. Not for warmth, but for something else. Something quieter, slower. Maybe even safer. In the morning, she found a wild flower tucked into her saddlebag. A daisy, pale and imperfect. She didn't ask if it was from him. Didn't need to. The days ahead still stretched uncertain. But for the first time in years, she wanted to keep riding. They rode through the valley of dry bones and mesquite, a land stitched in silence and shaped by time. The girl no longer flinched at the sound of hoofbeats. Her body, though still thin from hunger past, had learned balance in the saddle. Her hands, once shaking and unsure, now moved steady with the reins. What hadn't changed was the way he watched the horizon, always with that solemn quiet, like he expected someone or something to arrive and take the silence back. She wanted to ask, more than once, what he was looking for. But she didn't. They had learned to live in the space between words, and asking too much was like cracking glass. On the 5th week since he'd bought her freedom, they came to a weather-worn cabin nestled in a dip between two hills. It leaned slightly to the left, its roof slumped from one too many storms, but it stood. The man dismounted first, walking toward the porch with a slow kind of reverence. She followed, waiting at the fence. He ran a hand along the frame of the door like it was a memory. She could see it then, not just as shelter, but as something remembered. "This yours?" she asked. He nodded. "Was. Who lives here now?" "No one." They moved inside together. Dust motes floated in thick sunbeams, the floor creaked beneath their weight, and the air smelled of pine and old sorrow. She stepped lightly, almost afraid to disturb the stillness. He left her to wander while he checked the well and brought in kindling. She found a small shelf above the hearth, 3 carved horses lined in a row. One was chipped. All were coated in dust. Beside them, an old photograph had curled at the edges. A girl, maybe 12, with braids and a stubborn smile. She turned when he entered again, holding a tin of coffee and a bag of oat. "Your sister?" she asked. He paused, then nodded once. "She the one who?" "Died. Long time ago." She watched his jaw tighten, but he didn't look away. "How?" she whispered. "Water fever. Took her in a night." The girl traced the outline of the photo gently, as if afraid it might fade. "She looks like she laughed loud." "She did." His voice softened, like a violin string plucked too gently to ring. "This was our place. After Ma died, Pa drank himself into the ground. She and I built the fence, fed the goat, buried the dog when he passed. She was more wild than the horses." She said nothing, just sat down beside the hearth. She didn't tell him she understood. That she too had once held laughter in her ribs, that somewhere long ago, she'd had someone who made her feel like she belonged. Instead, she reached for the poker and stirred the coals to life. They stayed in the cabin for 3 days. He patched the holes in the roof. She swept the dust from corners. She made soup with whatever dry goods they found in the cellar, and he fixed the hinges on the barn door. They lived like two people who didn't need much, only quiet and something not to run from. The second night, he left a carving knife by her bedroll. No explanation. Just laid it there, then went to his side of the room and lay down. She understood the gesture. It wasn't out of fear. It was permission. If she needed to leave, ever, he would never stop her. That night, she didn't sleep with her boots on. On the 4th morning, they saddled up again. There was no talk of staying. Some places, even safe ones, carried too many ghosts to be homes again. They headed north. The land grew greener, the air less cruel. She began to hum sometimes, mostly to the mule, who responded with a twitch of the ear or a snort. The cowboy never said anything about the music, but he never rode ahead when she hummed. He stayed close, as if protecting the note. In a town called Granger's Bluff, they stopped for supplies. It was a real town, with painted storefronts, a proper schoolhouse, and a church bell that rang the hours. She'd forgotten the sound of order. It startled her. While he bartered with the blacksmith for nails, she wandered toward the bakery. The scent of fresh bread curled through the air like a song, warm and tempting. She was about to step inside when a voice cut through the street like a whip. "Well, I'll be damned." She turned. He stood 10 paces away, clean jacket, slick smile, and the same serpent eyes. "Mr. Harlan. I thought you died in some ditch," he said, striding toward her with a grin that made her spine stiffen. Didn't think the mute would keep you long. Guess even strays find homes sometimes. She backed up, the bakery door still behind her. She could smell sugar, but her mouth filled with metal. Where is he? She asked low. Who? The cowboy? Probably sharpening sticks in a corner somewhere. Harlan laughed. You really think he bought you for keeps? Her hands clenched. The ribbon in her braid felt suddenly too bright. He didn't buy me, she said. Harlan reached for her arm, quick and careless. She flinched, and stopped, because another hand gripped Harlan's wrist. The cowboy had arrived without a word. He stood between them now, his expression blank calm. But his grip was iron. Harlan jerked back, chuckling nervously. Easy, friend. Wasn't touchin' nothin', that don't belong. She don't belong, the cowboy said, voice like gravel and thunder. Not to you. Not to me. To herself. Harlan's smirk twitched, but something in the cowboy's stillness made him step back. Men like Harlan always folded under silence. They thrived on fear, not steel-spined quiet. He tipped his hat mockingly and walked off, vanishing into the alley's shadow. She stood frozen. The cowboy didn't touch her. Just looked at her, waiting. I'm fine, she said, even though her voice trembled. He nodded once. Then, for the first time, offered his name. Call me Eli, he said. She blinked. He hadn't spoken it before. Hadn't needed to. But now it felt like something sacred. Something planted between them like a seed. She held out her hand. My name's Lark, she said, surprising herself with how steady it sounded. Eli didn't smile. But he didn't need to. He just took her hand in his, rough and warm. They shook like two traders sealing a promise neither had the words for. They left town before sunset. The mule plodded behind them, the horses silent. Lark didn't look back. That night, as the fire crackled and stars blinked back into their places above the sky, she whispered across the distance between their bedrolls. Thank you. Eli stirred the coals, never looking up. Don't thank me, he said. Just stay free. And for the first time in her life, Lark believed she might. The road westward stretched like a ribbon fraying at the edges. Lark rode it with the quiet rhythm of someone who had begun to trust the silence between hoofbeats, the hush between words. Days passed like chapters she could finally read, each one small, steady, almost ordinary. And it was in the ordinary that something extraordinary began to root itself in her chest. Eli didn't talk much. He never had. But his silences had shifted. They were no longer walls, now they were windows. She saw through them. Into a man built by long sorrow, but who chose not to spread it. He repaired fences even when no one asked. He stopped to bury a crow when they passed it in the road, wings broken and eyes already gone. He never explained those small, gentle things. But Lark saw them. And more than that, she remembered them. By late autumn, the air had thinned. Trees wore the last of their golden leaves like fading jewelry. They followed the old cattle trail toward a piece of land Eli said he'd known in another life. The mule grew slow, heavy with age, and they let it set the pace. Lark didn't mind. She liked how the days stretched longer now, soft as unspoken thoughts. One morning, after a frost had turned the grass silver, Eli showed her a glen just beyond a line of twisted pines. Creek runs here, he said. Land's clean. Ground holds firm. She looked around, no buildings, no fences, nothing claimed. Just the bones of an old world waiting to grow something new. You want to stay? She asked. He shrugged. Only if you do. They built with their hands. First a lean-to, then walls, then a roof that groaned when the wind leaned in too hard. Lark stitched curtains from burlap sack. Eli carved the doorframe with wildflowers. Neither one said the word home aloud, but it settled between them anyway, like a sleeping animal they didn't want to wake. The days bled into weeks. Lark planted herbs by the window, watched them take root and reach. She'd never watched anything grow before without being warned it might die. Here, things lived. And she, perhaps, was starting to believe she could too. Still, there were nights when sleep evaded her. When old memories rose like smoke from beneath floorboards. In those moments, she would slip outside barefoot and sit on the porch. Eli always joined her, not with questions, but with his presence. He'd sit beside her, sometimes hand her a cup of tea, sometimes nothing at all. And always she felt less alone after. It was one of those nights when trouble returned. They heard horses before they saw them. 3 riders, close and deliberate. Not lost, not passing through. Eli stood without speaking, hand resting on the rifle near the door. Lark stepped behind him, heart thudding a pattern she thought she'd unlearned. The men dismounted. One carried the look of a foreman, hat pressed flat and boots too polished for real dirt. Another was older, sallow-eyed. The third, the youngest, watched Lark too long. "We heard you had a girl," the lead man said, voice sharp with practice. "Young Runaway. Sold cheap in Drabone. Man's lookin' to take her back." Lark felt the sting of old panic curl through her limbs. She hadn't heard that town's name in weeks. Hadn't remembered what it felt like to be something owned. Eli stepped forward. "Ain't no one here owned." The younger man smirked. "That her speakin' for herself?" Eli didn't look back. "She don't have to." The silence that followed crackled with something more dangerous than anger, certainty. Lark stepped from behind him and stared straight at the man who had spoken her name like it was property. "She's gone," she said. "Left the night she got free. Ain't been seen since." The men exchanged glances. But Eli didn't move. Not a flicker of doubt, not a twitch in his jaw. Just stillness. The kind that came from deep knowing. "You got no proof," the foreman said finally. "Don't need it." Eli stepped closer. "You ride out now, there won't be a problem." The men hesitated, but something in Eli, some old storm behind the eyes, made them believe. They mounted without another word. Dust rose behind them as they vanished down the trail. Lark exhaled slowly. Her knees trembled, but she held herself upright. Eli didn't speak until the dust settled. Then he turned, not to check on her, not to comfort, but to stand beside her again, equal and unafraid. "They'll talk," she said. "Word'll spread. Let it." "You're not afraid?" He shrugged. "Men like that only know fear. I ain't built from it." Lark didn't answer, but she reached out, fingertips brushing the back of his hand. He didn't flinch. Just turned his palm upward so her fingers could rest there fully. It was nothing grand. But it was enough. That night she laid her head against his shoulder beneath the stars, and he leaned his cheek against her hair. No kiss passed. No promises. Just a hush of belonging that said more than vows ever could. The next morning the world was still. The birds returned. The mule brayed like nothing had happened. But something had. Something unspoken and deep, settled into the soil between them. Later, as they cleared the field for planting, Lark found an old iron key buried in the dirt. She held it up, curious. Eli took it, turned it once in his fingers, then handed it back. "For when you build your own door," he said. She stared at the key heavy with rust and forgotten use. She didn't ask what it opened. She only smiled. Evening fell in soft shades of lavender. They sat on the porch again, sipping coffee that had long since lost its bitterness. "I used to think survival was enough," Lark said. "But maybe it isn't." Eli tilted his head. "What is?" "Maybe being seen. And choosing to stay seen." He nodded. "Takes more courage." "I'm learning," she said. "You're teaching," he replied. She laughed, a sound still unfamiliar but real. The wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. Somewhere nearby, a coyote howled. But it didn't sound like a threat. Just another voice in the wilderness, singing its name. Lark leaned into Eli's side. He rested his hand over hers. Still silent, but full of words that didn't need to be spoken. They watched the stars come out, one by one, not as signs or omens, but simply as companions in the sky. The fire behind them burned low, casting shadows on the walls of the place they'd built with nothing but patience, hands, and hope. Tomorrow would come with its own troubles, perhaps, but for tonight they belonged, not to each other, but beside each other. And that was enough to carry them forward. In the hush that followed, she whispered a truth not even the wind could steal. "I'm not running any more." And he, who never needed to answer quickly, said only this: "Good. We've got planting to do." Winter crept in like a memory, soft at first, then sudden, stealing color from the sky and breath from the earth. The land hardened under frost, and the mornings came quieter, wrapped in gray mist. Lark learned to move with the cold, how to layer her shirts, how to start the fire before her fingers grew stiff. She grew into the season, into herself, like something finally learning what it meant to stay. She and Eli built slow, as always. A shed for tools, a fence for the mule, who now wandered less and brayed more. They chopped wood and salted meat, listened to the snow begin to fall in the distance. The hush between them had grown thick and warm, no longer filled with questions, only knowing. One night, as the sky bruised purple and dusk clung to the edges of the hills, a letter arrived, handed over by a boy on horseback, red-faced and shivering. Eli took it, gave the boy a piece of jerky and sent him on. Lark watched from the doorway as Eli opened the envelope with his blade, read the folded paper slowly, once, then again. He didn't speak until they were seated by the fire, 2 mugs steaming, her hands cupped around warmth. "You ever heard of Crosswell?" he asked. She shook her head. "Rail town. East of the hills. Big enough for banks and men who think they run the world." Lark waited. "He never told a story he didn't have to. That man Harlan, he's stirred up trouble. Put out a claim, sayin' I took what was his. Got folks hunting. Not for justice. For the bounty." Her breath caught. "How much?" 500. Lark stood too quickly. The cup clattered to the floor, untouched. "We have to leave." Eli didn't move. "They'll chase. Doesn't matter where." "So we hide," she said. "We burn the cabin, go south, change names." "No," he said, softly but firmly. "This place is ours." The truth of it struck her hard. She looked around, the worn boots by the door, the scarf she'd hung over the cracked window, the shelf lined with pine cones and bones she'd collected on long walks. Home. They had built something real. But real things drew shadows. "I can't let them take you," she said. "They're not coming for me," he replied. "They're coming for the story he told." She knelt beside him. "Then let's rewrite it." He looked at her then, really looked, and in that moment, whatever had been unspoken between them no longer needed words. The next morning they prepared. Eli loaded the rifle, cleaned the knife, saddled the mule. Lark took her carving tool and etched a line of wildflowers across the doorframe, a small defiance, a last mark in case they never returned. They didn't dress for battle. They dressed for truth. They rode at sunrise, cold air tearing through the valleys. No conversation passed between them on the trail, only glances, hers full of fire, his steady as stone. The closer they came to Crosswell, the more the sky seemed to darken, clouds thick as judgment. By midday, the town rose before them, all brick and noise, carriages rattling over packed dirt. Lark felt her chest tighten. She remembered places like this, places where girls disappeared and no one looked twice. They left the horses at the edge of town and walked side by side into the square. Harlan stood beneath a signpost, surrounded by 3 men and a deputy. He looked cleaner than ever, smug as a snake in sunlight. "Well, well," he said. "The girl returns." "I came for truth," Lark said, her voice steady, clear. He laughed. "You have none." She stepped forward. "You sold me for $5, like I was cattle. Then you lied about it. I claimed property I was owed." Eli spoke now, his voice slow and sharp. "You mean the person you trapped, locked in a barn, listed without a name." "She was mine by contract," Harlan snapped. "Her father owed. I paid." "No paper ever made a person yours," Lark said. Murmurs rippled through the crowd gathering. Folks paused at doors. A woman near the mercantile stopped sweeping. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet, the original ledger from the auction house. Signed by Harlan. Not for purchase of a servant, but a bid, a sale, a theft. He handed it to the deputy. "This is forgery," Harlan barked. "Lies." The deputy, older and not fond of fools, read it once, then looked at Lark. "You choose to press charges?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. That would still make me part of his story. I just want him forgotten." The deputy nodded. "Then he leaves Crosswell. Tonight. And never returns." Harlan sputtered, cursed, threatened. But the law turned their backs on him. A man unmasked holds no power. As he slunk from town, Eli turned to Lark. "We can go." But she shook her head. "Not yet. There was something more to do." She walked to the church at the corner of the square. The pastor, a gentle man with bad eyes, opened the door and led her to the pulpit. She stood there, just for a moment. Not to preach. Not to plead. But to speak. "I was taken," she said to the few who'd followed. "And forgotten. Treated like nothing. But I lived. And someone saw me. Not as broken, but brave." She looked at Eli, standing quiet as ever in the back pew. "If you ever see someone in chains, speak. If you ever see someone running, don't chase, walk beside. You might be saving more than you know." No applause followed. Just a stillness. A listening. And that was enough. They left Crosswell without fanfare. Back through the woods. Through snow that had started falling like feathers from a great gray sky. When they reached the cabin, it hadn't burned. It stood waiting. Eli turned to her on the porch. "You could still go," he said. "Start anywhere." Lark looked at the sky. Then at the ground she had tended, the windows she had washed. The chair by the fire, shaped to her body. "I already started," she said. "Right here." He nodded. And in the hush that followed, she stepped forward, slipped her fingers into his. "I came into this world without a name that mattered. But you gave me space to find one." Eli pressed his forehead to hers. "You gave me silence that healed." That night they didn't sleep far apart. There was no need for the fire to do all the warming. The wind howled, but it couldn't touch what had been made between them. Not bought. Not stolen. But chosen. And in the dark, beneath a sky cleared of storm, Lark finally believed in something she never dared name before. Peace. A kind of freedom that didn't need flight. Only love, quiet as snowfall and just as lasting.